Let me first start by saying just how great it is to be back in Nashville. I lived here from 1997 to 2000 while at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Go ahead and I'm going to be nodding continuously.
Fine.
My non-clear, high-resolution photo there of the Divinity School. And then again, 2003 to 2007 for PhD work. So much of my work now in ecological theology draws upon moral, intellectual, theological, relational, institutional influences that shaped me during my years here. One of the key influences during my MDiv years, I studied with Sally McFaig, an ecofeminist pioneer, who, as I was coming as a young licensed local pastor out of South Dakota, had just experienced, as a young 23-year-old serving two small rural congregations, the pain of the ongoing farm crises in our rural areas. Officiated a lot of funerals of folks dying of cancer in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Even though we didn't openly talk about it, a recognition of the connections between industrial agricultural practices, heavy chemical usage on our landscapes, and what that's doing to our farmers, our farm workers, producers, consumers. So I knew I was called to ministry, believed in the good news of Jesus, and I had fallen in love with these dear people, but I had no sense of how to make sense of what was happening to their landscapes, their main streets, and ultimately to their bodies. So theologians like Sally McFaig and Doug Meeks, if you could advance, sorry. Ann and I went to Divinity School together, so I'm like nodding to her, and she's like, yeah, I know Sally McFaig. Really helped me and many of us draw the connections between theological understandings, global economies, environments, communities. Doug Meeks in particular, as a Wesleyan Methodist theologian, helped me draw deeply on my tradition, the United Methodist tradition, and through my parents back into the EUB, Evangelical United Brethren, holiness, radical pietist traditions. I also, Anna, if you could move ahead, I also had the opportunity when James Lawson came back to begin teaching at Vanderbilt after he had been expelled in the 60s as part of the organizers seeking to integrate the lunch counters downtown. I was able to take the first class that he taught back at Vanderbilt, which was really powerful, and was deeply influenced by his work in nonviolent civil disobedience, community organizing, and ways of drawing upon the gospel as a community organizing strategy for resistance and power building. I also received a grant to study at the farm south of us, Somerville, Tennessee, with Albert Bates, one of my mentors in permaculture design and eco-village design, looking at the permaculture eco-village movement as a potential model for the contemporary church. And Albert continues to inspire me. He's doing work now on biochar, remediation work, and seeking to trap carbon in soil through an ancient indigenous practice of using biochar. And then next slide, this handsome individual in the back of the room, Jason Atkins, is a dear, dear friend who we connected over a decade ago around deep convictions around land, agriculture, food, justice, community. Jason, I didn't know Jason would be joining us today, but for those of you in Nashville, in Tennessee, in the Southeast, Jason's at Trevecca Nazarene University and is doing some of the most innovative, creative work around creation justice in the country. And so to the extent he's willing to take on folks stopping by to visit and consult with, I strongly lift up his work and his witness in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood here in Nashville. Next slide. So this is me, graduation from the Divinity School over this way. Anyone recognize this archway over here? This is just Fondren here on campus. It's our daughter Audrey, who was overjoyed. Her dad had finally finished his dissertation and was graduating with his PhD. Next slide. So I wrote my dissertation here on drawing on the holiness, Wesleyan, pietist, communitarian traditions, the agrarian, ecological traditions, to articulate a theology of Holy Communion that urges Christians to actively participate in emerging new food systems that are just, that are sustaining, that are life-giving. And so each chapter is broken up theologically in a critique of our food system and then practical models for how we might participate. So we now live in Evanston, Illinois. My wife Becky and I, Reverend Becky Eberhart, we met in library orientation at Vanderbilt Divinity School. So yeah, Nashville has profoundly shaped my life. I teach theology and ecology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. I direct a new MA in public ministry with concentrations in racial justice, child advocacy, poverty, and ecological regeneration. We've got several students here from Garrett in that concentration. Josh Richardson in the back being one of them. I said, Josh, you've heard this. You don't need to join, but he's a glutton for punishment, I guess. I'm also very active in Evanston and the surrounding Chicago community. I very much see my vocation as I aspire to be an organic intellectual, one whose thinking and writing and research and teaching is very much rooted in churches, grassroots struggles for justice, community civic organizations, and more. So I'm active on Citizens Greener Evanston, very active with our Subcommittee Environmental Justice Evanston, seeking to remove a waste transfer station in a predominantly black, impoverished neighborhood in Evanston. And I also serve on the Equity and Empowerment Commission in Evanston, which is seeking to bring racial and other forms of justice to the municipality through policy. One of the things that I do as one who seeks to be connected, not just in the classroom and through academic skills, but beyond, is I do a lot of workshops in churches, particularly throughout the Midwest, called the Hope for Creation workshop. And it's a full day workshop with 3 different sessions. The first session, you can kind of just slowly scroll through here. The first session is called the Great Uncreation. And we spend over an hour kind of walking through the 7 days of creation in reverse as we attend to the ways in which we humans, the anthropoi, are deconstructing, undoing God's creative, generative, regenerative powers for life. And we confront the very hard truths of where we find ourselves. I assume you're at a workshop like this. We've engaged many of those realities throughout the last few days. We're not going to spend time there, but I want you to understand, you can stop there, that this work that we'll be engaged in theologically is rooted in that sense of urgency and rooted in that sense of the crises that we face. This is the context today in which Pope Francis is calling for a global ecological conversion, a contemplative turn, he says, toward the mysterious gift of the creation, and a spirituality of entering into loving communion with all the members of God's creation. Thomas Berry, a geologist, theologian, argued that the great work of our time is to integrate all human activities justly into the rhythms and the needs of the biosphere. Joanna Macy, you can actually back up. Joanna Macy has called for a great turning. The Stockholm Environmental Institute speaks of the great transition. And again, we've heard that call. All of society, all of what we do is bound up in the crises we face and needs to be engaged in transitioning. So the third session then, you can kind of slowly go through. This third session then looks at really concrete ways in which Christians as individuals, Jason, that was our backyard. You can see our permaculture food forest starting to emerge. When we moved in, our side lot was completely dead. And there was grass there, but the prior owner had used a lot of chemicals, a lot of heavy fertilizer, and so the soil health was just, there wasn't much activity. there were no birds, and so we've slowly been transitioning to natives and fruit tree guilds, and this time of year, even as our insectary populations continue to plummet, there are spaces where when we participate in the good energies of the creation, life starts to return. And so this is a space that for me is profoundly regenerative. We look at the Green Faith movement and Greening the Church. We look at, keep going, some of the resources that are available, edited by Pat Watkins, the gentleman right here in the front. Chet Myers' watershed discipleship concept of bringing energies of discipleship, keeping, and care to the non-human spheres. The Wild Church Network, Beth Norcross is leading a workshop right now. He's connected with this. Those of you from Minnesota certainly know the work of Bishop Sally Dick now in the Northern Illinois Conference, and she has brought that same focus to our work there. The Earth Keepers, as we've heard, and keep going. Also Free UMC, and then Ministries of Resistance and Advocacy. And then front row, I forget your name. Marla.
That was my campaign.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I've been using that photo for like a year now, and I hadn't met you before.
Can you go back, please, so we can see it again?
No, this one right here. Tell us real quickly about the campaign.
We were resisting the construction of a pipeline into the West Roxbury neighborhood of Massachusetts. This day was the first day that the clergy took action. It was in May of 2016, and there were leaders from 18 different faith communities, 8 of which were not Christian, and it was pretty powerful. They stopped construction for an hour and a half just by sitting down. There's a Torah scroll in there with a cantor, which is a pretty big deal, and a lot of these same people participated in an action a few months later, in which we recognized that a heat wave that was predicted in Pakistan had caused people to dig an anticipatory mass grave because they hadn't had the foresight to do so the year before, and they didn't have a way to bury people. And so we declared it to be the age of anticipatory climate mass graves, and we asked some of these clergy to say their mass graves eulogies. And it wasn't like we were pretending that we were dying. We were taking responsibility for the trench that would cause more trenches like that. When that mass grave was long and they laid people in it head to toe and it looked like a pipeline trench, and we said, this one right here is going to create more of those, and we're not going to pretend like it's not our responsibility anymore. We lost, but in a way we didn't, because we bore witness, and we brought out lots of people, thousands of people.
So we will need a whole host of strategies and tactics and tools and methods to be about this work of transition, including direct action, civil disobedience, and getting loud, as we heard this morning.
I will say there's not a United Methodist there.
That needs to change. Yeah. So what I want to share here this morning, we just have like 45 minutes. I want to share a condensed version of what I do in the second workshop, which is exploring basic Christian beliefs, with an aim of identifying how certain received theological understandings, you can hold there, malformed theological understandings, I would call them, have contributed to the Great Uncreation. But also how reformed or more faithful theological understandings may participate in the great work of planetary healing. So as a theologian, this is part of my contribution to the great work. It's not all that's needed, but it's a part of what's needed. And not just for the work of those of us who are paid to do theology, not just the professional theologians, but for all persons of faith, all the baptized within the church, to be about this work of healing our understandings of who God is, how God is, what it means to be saved, what it means to live a good life, how we follow Jesus. So that's what this workshop's about. Let me just make a connection with Catherine Wilkinson's speech last night. She talked about 5 key steps that are needed, right? She talked about alter rules, advance technologies, shift capital, change behavior, and 5, shape culture. And that includes, she said, the stories we tell and the paradigms that we live out of, the basic worldviews about how we understand, what we understand reality to be. So that's what this is about. It's about the basic theological narrative, the Christian story we tell, what we believe to be true, what we teach our children, what we sing in our hymns, how it is that we pray and why. So back in 1966, many of you know this story, medieval historian Lynn White wrote a very influential essay called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, in which he argued that the problem of the exploitation of nature, particularly in the West, has its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But he also suggested at the end of the essay that the answer will necessarily have to be religious as well. And interestingly enough, he pointed at the end to St. Francis of Assisi as the patron saint of ecology. So for good or ill, our most basic beliefs about God, human vocation, the good life wield tremendous power. And it's the responsibility of those of us stewarding our respective traditions, and that's everyone here, to be asking critical questions. What do we believe? What have we been taught? What are the fruits of what we've been taught? What are we passing on to our children and youth and the generations to come about these core questions? Brief anecdote, and then we'll get to work. I was done speaking one time at a church event, and an older gentleman came up and said, climate change cannot be happening, and it cannot be true, and here's why. Because God is sovereign. And if what you're telling us is true, that human beings are responsible for shifting the biosphere to the level that you're claiming it's happening, then what you're telling me is that God is not in control. So the root source of his climate denial was theological. It was his doctrine of God that was getting in the way of his joining in the work. He had other avenues to join in the work, love of God, love of neighbor, and basic stewardship ethic, but that link was too much because of what I would argue to be a malformed theological understanding. So again, this isn't all of the work, but it is a crucial part of the work. Are there any non-Christians here? I don't want to assume that everyone here is rooted in a Christian tradition, okay? What we'll be doing here is attending, seeking to steward the Christian tradition, but this is work for all of our religious traditions, and thankfully it's happening at the level of our global religious traditions. But we'll take responsibility here. That's part of my niche as a baptized Christian, as an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. All right, so as many of you know, one of the key scriptural passages that often comes up is from the first chapter of Genesis. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them and blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air. So the key word here being dominion. Practically speaking, we in the modern industrial West have interpreted that command to have dominion to mean control, to dominate, to use the earth for our own purposes, to manipulate, to use up. Creation is made up of natural resources to do with as we please. So you can go back. This was the root of White's critique of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That understanding dominion as domination directly contributes to landscapes like this mountaintop removal site near Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Now, as many, and I'm sure some of you have heard this argument as well, but I often hear it. God put the fossil fuels in the earth for us to use them. It is our role as those gifted with dominion to use them. If we do not use them, we are not, right? So there's this distorted sense of what it means to be a human being created by God that's at work here. Now, as many biblical scholars have noted, the Hebrew word for dominion, radah, is also used to describe the righteous king. The one who is described throughout the Hebrew scriptures as one who cares for the people, the righteous king, who judges rightly, who ensures the well-being of the land, and whose particular concern is for the poor. One of the few times that Radah is used in relationship to God is from Psalm 22. May God have dominion, or Radah, from sea to sea and from the rivers to the ends of the earth. The psalmist then proceeds to describe the nature of God's rule. For God delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. From oppression and violence, God redeems their life. So for Christians who read the Hebrew Scriptures through the lens of the New Testament, Jesus ultimately is the final standard for true lordship, true dominionship, for righteous rule. How would you describe the nature of Jesus' reign? What is the nature of Jesus' power?
Vulnerability.
Vulnerability, humility, love, compassion, forgiveness, grace, suffering love, right? So to have dominion in the way of Jesus, the righteous king, is not to control, not to manipulate, not to dominate, not to use up and discard, but to care for, to bring life to.
Could we go back to that passage for just a moment? I'm trying to remember my Hebrew, and it's there. Yes. From oppression and violence, he redeems their life. That phrase, he redeems their life, is the definition of righteousness. I've heard the cry of my people, I've come to deliver them. Exodus.
Yeah.
That's Dr. Belden.
Yeah.
You may remember.
Yeah.
But
So
that's an indelible kind of thing for reading the Old Testament.
So, thank you, Pastor Bruce. You may remember John's account of Jesus' resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene in the garden. And remember that she mistook him for a gardener, right? So Jesus is the one who tends, who nurtures with the Spirit to bring forth life, bring forth fruitfulness, whose life is given over, whose dominion is for the sake of the flourishing of the good creation. It's a very different understanding of dominion. Let's go to related teaching concerning how we've interpreted the Imago Dei, the image of God. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. You may want to reinterpret these days to speak of siblings, to expand our understanding of human orientation. So traditionally, the doctrine of the Imago Dei has focused on what was believed to be unique about human beings, what distinguished us from other human beings. So Christian teaching has located the Imago Dei in the human capacity to reason, or in the soul as compared to the body. The Imago Dei is something immaterial, it's our freedom to choose. From an ecological perspective, there are at least two potential concerns here. One is that by having so emphasized human forms of intelligence, we have entirely missed the myriad of ways other members of the creation are not only intelligent, but differently intelligent in astonishingly complex ways, beautifully, mysteriously complex ways. So this is a concern about anthropocentrism and androcentrism, about regarding human beings not just as the pinnacle of creation, but as the sole lens through which to understand the value of all other life forms. Only human beings are created Imago Dei, therefore we sit at the height. There are two books I would recommend here. Some of you may have read them, The Hidden Life of Trees, and especially Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. Have any of you read Braiding Sweetgrass? Several of you have. You can affirm how powerful the book it is. A second concern is that by locating the Imago Dei in that which is material, abstract, Christian teaching has directly and indirectly denigrated the body. It's denigrated materiality and things of the earth. But a disembodied understanding of the human being is really quite foreign to a biblical worldview. Here's from the second creation account in Genesis. And I won't read, we want to make sure we keep moving for the sake of time. But note that the connection between the ground, Adamah, and human being, Adam. Notice that the Hebrew word for the Adamah is dust, soil, clay, matter, country. So we are earth creatures. We are creatures of the land. We are earthlings. So you could say that biblical anthropology is what we would today call holistic. The Hebrew name for Eve, or the next, is related to the Hebrew verb hawa, which means to live. So Eve means living one, source of life. Eve Ehwa is the mother of life. So who are we? What is our vocation? We are earth creatures formed by God and planted in a garden of delight. Eden, that's what Eden means, garden of delight. And that is the original and the enduring intention of God for we humans. To thrive, to be fully alive as whole persons, as enfleshed spirits, as inspirited bodies within the entire delightful garden that is our earthly home. That's who we are. That's our vocation. Now, to return to the first account, in the image of God, God created them, male and female. We can affirm here that we were created to be in relationship. We are who we are only in and through relationships, not as isolated individuals. And not just with other human beings, but we are who we are only in and through our relationships with all of the creatures of the earth. This is a deeply biblical affirmation. It's also an ecological understanding. We are who we are as human beings only in and through all the other members of the biosphere. It's also central, as many of you know, to almost all of the world's indigenous cosmologies. And the beautiful affirmation of our Lakota kin of all our relations, the plant nation, the mineral nation, the water nation, the sky nation, the earth nation. So let's reinterpret again our calling, our human vocation, kind of a summary of what we've just affirmed. This is from Stephen Boomer Prediger's book, which I would recommend to you for the beauty of the earth. Particularly a helpful book. He self-identifies as an evangelical Christian. Perhaps a book that can be helpful in congregations and settings that may be wary from a conservative evangelical standpoint around some of these issues. Someone willing to read this, and you've been hearing me talk, if you're able to read that small in print.
In the history of the interpretation of Genesis, most of the attention has been given to chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. There we read that humans were given dominion. For many, this means that humans have license to exploit the non-human creatures of the earth. That is to say, dominion is understood as domination. But dominion does not mean domination, but responsible care. Genesis 1:28 must be placed alongside Genesis 2:15, where we are told that God put the human in the garden to till it and keep it. To till means to serve the earth for its own sake, and to keep means to protect the earth as one caringly guards something valuable. We are to serve the earth for its own good and to protect creation as God protects us. We are called by God, in short, to be earth keepers. We are given the joy and the responsibility to lovingly keep the earth that is the earth in all its intricate fullness and dynamic relatedness.
Now, what I typically like to do here is to stop and pause and to invite reflection, dialogue around how we may better embrace and teach and form through our Christian education programs, our confirmation, our higher schools of higher education, how in addition to helping persons identify their particular call, their particular gifts, how we might instill this as a common shared sense of vocation for all of us, to be earth keepers, to be nurturers of the goodness of the whole creation. and then to explore what that would look like to embrace. I think for the sake of time, to leave some time at the end for engagement, I'm going to keep us moving. But take that question with you. How do we claim and teach and instill for everyone the vocation of earth keeping? So let's move to another doctrine. You can go to the next. Three of the most basic, enduring, basic questions, Theology 101, that are raised related to the doctrine of salvation are very simple. From what do we need to be saved? For what are we saved? And who shall save us? For much of the Christian tradition, especially in Western Christianity, the answers to these questions have been deeply shaped by the worldview of ancient Greece, by Platonism and Neoplatonism. Simply stated, in this worldview, God has created a hierarchically ordered universe in which God sits at the top of being, the very bottom is non-being, angels, demons, man, woman, animals, plants, minerals. And in this hierarchy, this cosmology, the great chain of being, to be closer to God is to be further away from the things of the earth, plants, animals, material. And it maps on to patriarchal systems. To be closer to God is to be man, to be a free man. The human being itself is hierarchically ordered, so that rationality is higher than the emotions, which is higher than the body, right? And so to draw closer to God means turning away from the emotions, the body, the earth, animals. And think about how this is woven into our basic piety, right? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full into his wonderful face. And the things of this world or earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his power and grace, right? That's what it means to draw closer to God, is to turn away from the earth, from bodies, from materiality. When I die, glory in glory, by and by I'll fly away. To reunite with God, ultimately, is to escape the earth, escape the body, right? This is rooted in not necessarily a biblical cosmology, but a Hellenic one. And why does this matter? Well, why care about climate change, ultimately, if this world has no enduring eternal significance? If our bodies and the body of the earth are ultimately going to be discarded so that we can reunite with God, then what really is the problem with honeybee colony collapse disorder? Ultimately, there's not a problem in this cosmology. Next slide. Someone read this quote from Karl Barth.
Perhaps nowhere else has Christianity fallen farther away than precisely in this estimation of the relation between spirit and matter, inner and outer. Redemption is not the separation of spirit from matter. It is not that humanity goes to heaven, but rather that God's kingdom comes to us in matter and on earth. Jesus and the movement for social justice.
So how does God come to us? In whom is the kingdom enfleshed? Well, at the heart of the Christian faith, the Christian tradition, is the belief that Jesus of Nazareth is Emmanuel, God with us. And so to believe that Jesus is God with us in the flesh, divinity and humanity, spirit and earth united in incarnation, is to affirm that God does indeed love the world. And this means rejecting, not embracing, a dualistic, hierarchical understanding of body, soul, heaven, earth, etc. So these are some of the earliest images of Jesus, go back, depicted as the Good Shepherd, as the one who cares for the flock. And in this sense, salvation is best understood as God's restoration of abundant life. I have come, Jesus says, that you might have life and have it abundantly. So the word salvation comes from the Latin root salus, which means health, which means healing. So to be saved is to be restored to the wholeness of health. Now, for those of us here who are United Methodists or from a Methodist tradition, how many might that be here? Assume the majority, if not everyone. This holistic understanding of salvation was central to John Wesley's life, ministry, and teaching. This is from his his pamphlet, The Character of a Methodist. I won't read it all, but it's an affirmation, you can go to the next, of the work of the Methodist, which is to do good, which is to seek the well-being of all, including in particular their bodies. You can go to the next. Wesley scholar Randy Maddox has written a great deal on Wesley's understanding of salvation as holistic, as integrated and integrative. And what he means is that salvation for Wesley is not just a future thing, but a present thing as well. It's not just intellectual, cognitive assent to a certain set of propositions. It's also trust in one's heart, the emotions, the affective level. It's not just the forgiveness of sins, but the transformation of one's whole life as well. Not just for individuals, but for society. And not just for souls, but for bodies. In fact, Wesley placed great emphasis on physical health and healing as a matter of salvation. It's likely that the most widely read publication of Wesley's during his time was his little pamphlet called Primitive Physic. Anyone ever run across that? Several of you, right? A collection of home remedies based on common fruits, herbs, and plants that especially for the sake of the poor, because the apothecaries were overcharging their services and inaccessible to the poor, especially for the sake of the poor, could be widely available. Planters outside the window, backyard gardens, for the sake of healing. Now, when I was first introduced to primitive physic, probably in Doug's class, there was a bit of a sense of like crazy old Grandpa John, like, twist a lemon peel in the ear for an earache or whatnot. But what he was doing was tapping into a much deeper, long-standing medieval tradition of the parish priest also being the doctor, and likely rooted in much earlier native European traditions of holistic healing that were tied directly to indigenous, typically shepherded via women and women's doctors, but healing through our close relationship to the earth. So imagine if all of our United Methodist clergy, laity, children, youth, what if we were trained in organic gardening, in herbal medicine, to promote healthy, holy living as a matter not just of good ethics, stewardship, but as a matter of salvation. It's a matter of holiness. It's a matter of going on to perfection in the whole of life. So holistic in the sense of all-encompassing, but also because salvation for Wesley is about relationality. As he wrote in one sermon, Christianity, and we'll come to that in a second, Christianity is essentially a social religion. To turn it into a solitary religion is indeed to destroy it. We'll come back to the doctrine of the new creation in a bit, but while we're with Wesley, some of you may remember a couple years ago, Pope Francis seemed to tell a young child that he would see his dog, who had just recently died, in heaven. Dog lovers throughout rejoiced, animal rights groups celebrated. Apparently he didn't actually say this, so the follow-up headline said, "Sorry, Fido." But for Wesley, and you can go to the next, for Wesley, he's clear. Animals will share with us in the new creation. Not just human beings, but non-human others, non-human persons will share with us in the age that is to come. Now, connected to this, Wesley, somewhat unusual for his era, advocated for the compassionate treatment of animals. And he was a bit outspoken about the brutal treatment of animals, horses in particular. We'll keep moving, but this is from a journal article. So salvation then from a Wesleyan understanding means growing into, maturing into, and our enfleshed love of God, others, and the whole of creation. And so the classic Methodist question, are we going on to perfection? Are we going on to holiness or healthiness, loving wholeness in the whole of life, is still a central abiding question. If there is a charism for we United Methodists, this is one of them to offer the broader church and world. Again, if we had time, I would stop, and maybe we can come back to this at the end, and ask what it would mean as alternative, emerging new forms of Methodism are growing up in our time and are forming and will form. How might we recover this deep, holistic understanding of salvation? Whole persons in relationship, body, spirit, soul, mind, earth, systems, societies, economies. How might we recover this understanding of salvation and draw on the uniqueness of the Wesleyan tradition of organizing small groups, overseeing one another's forms of community organizing to live it out in everyday life? Apologies, we don't have time to take each of these up, but maybe we'll have time at the end. So then what do we say about the meaning of sin? What do we say about the meaning of sin? What is sin in the age of the Anthropocene, in the age of the sixth great extinction? Well, we can start by remembering the warning in Genesis 3 that the transgression of proper limits, what the first world charter for nature called the precautionary principle, you might remember that the transgression of proper limits may very well result in an expulsion from the Garden of Delight. So we should teach that the first sin against God's gift of proper boundaries, limits, is a good gift, but when we transgress them through disobedience, we lead to desertification. We lead to unfruitfulness, thorns, and thistles. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew is unequivocal on this. If someone could read this for him.
How we treat the earth and all of creation defines the relationship that each of us has with God. To commit a crime against the natural world is a sin. For humans to cause species to become extinct and to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for humans to injure other humans with disease, these things are sins. Even more, we need to make clear that human sins against the earth are intimately related to sins against human beings. We've talked a good deal about this the last few days, rightfully so. So we need to continue connecting the dots between ecological harm, racial violence, misogyny, economic systems that make people poor and exploit, and other forms of human domination and degradation. So to give just one example of environmental racism, study after study show that the two most predictive indicators of where you'll find a toxic site in the U.S. are race first and poverty second, and the consequences are stark. Concerning cancer, the African American population has the highest overall rate of cancer in the U.S. and the lowest 5-year survival rate of those with cancer. Asthma, 3 times as many black citizens compared with whites die from asthma. Among children, this rate increases to 5 to 1. Lead, children in poor urban areas are far more likely to be exposed to lead in their environments, not only in older homes, but through building wastes dumped in their neighborhood. Karen Baker Fletcher, eco-womanist theologian, has written a book called Sisters of Dust, Sisters of Spirit, that draws upon womanist theological insights to interrogate the dynamics of environmental racism and injustice and propose ways that we might think theologically and act theologically in response. So I would argue that to draw on the logic of
our Christian faith, we need to call these forms of crucifixion. These are the crucifixions of people and of places. We need to draw upon this language, the images, the rituals. Josh Richardson and I at Garrett, along with several others, drew upon the Passion narrative. We officiated at a funeral service for the earth during Holy Week this last April, where we used the liturgy of our tradition to mourn, to name, to recognize the dying of the earth, the death of human beings and creatures and systems, and to connect that with the crucifixion of divinity. The following week, Easter week, on Wednesday Chapel at the seminary, we hosted a service of resurrection to give witness to the power of God for new life. So let's turn to new creation. Apologies again, I'm moving so quickly. I want to get to a little time for conversation at the end. So amidst such widespread crucifixion, from where will our hope come? Who shall save us from this body of death? You could argue that the issue of our time ultimately may not be climate change or biodiversity collapse, but at the most basic level, the most basic spiritual level, whether we will be able to access resources of hope, of energies of resistance and powers for life. Because we know that despair leads to apathy, and apathy leads to inaction. And the last thing we need right now is inaction. So hope very well may be one of our most important sources of renewable, sustaining energy. Go to the next slide. The wellspring of hope is not ultimately rooted in our own capacities for change, but our deep conviction in God as creator, God as sustainer, God as redeemer. God who does not abandon us, but who is always ever present, seeking our renewal and revival. So, Christian hope, I often say, is not optimistic, because it begins with a very hard realism. That's why I begin these workshops. We didn't do it today, but it's why I begin these workshops with a pretty hard accounting of where we find ourselves. But neither is Christian faith pessimistic. And this is why I think it's important that we remember the stories. That's why I think it's so crucial that we began on Friday hearing the stories of the civil rights movement, of the organizers, of those who sacrificed through courage and intelligence and connectivity to bring about change in the midst of a situation in which it seemed it was truly hopeless. How do you dismantle white violence in a city like Nashville? How do you overturn literal food counters to incorporate a different kind of eating practice? Well, James Lawson, and who learned from Gandhi, who drew upon the inspiration of the Gospels and Jesus' practices of nonviolent civil disobedience, as we retell the stories, as we remember those who have gone before us and faced similarly dire situations, we continue to build our energies for hope. We find a way to make a way out of no way. For Christians, ultimately, go to the next one. Next. For Christians, ultimately, this is a hope that is centered in the resurrection of Jesus, in the gift of the Holy Spirit to raise up the crucified body of the Jew from Nazareth. It's rooted in the promise of the coming of the new creation, of a new heaven and a new earth. Go again to the next slide. If someone could read this. This is from Catholic ecofeminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson.
Since Jesus of Nazareth was composed of star stuff and earth stuff, and since his body existed in a network of relationships extending to the whole physical universe, his resurrection signals the beginning of the redemption, not just of other human beings, but of the whole creation itself, the whole natural world, all of matter in its endless permutations. An early Christian hymn that praised the crucified Christ as the firstborn from the dead also rightly declared that he is the firstborn of all creation, including things visible and invisible. In Christ's resurrection, the earth itself arose, declared St. Ambrose, a 4th century bishop of Milan.
Hope, hope, hope. True hope, deeply rooted hope, is active. It's subversive. It's restless, and it's endlessly creative. Surely there is no future. We are enslaved in Pharaoh's economy. We have no future. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept. All has been lost. The crucified body is dead and in a tomb. There is no future for this movement. This movement is dead. So the resurrection is God's subversive act. In the midst of our despair, our sense of loss, and it ought to motivate us with profound sense of hope. One more slide and then we'll stop and engage. This is from a more evangelical biblical scholar, N.T. Wright. You could have someone read this as well.
When God saves people in this way, by working through His Spirit to bring them to faith and by leading them to follow Jesus in discipleship, prayer, holiness, hope, and love, such people are designed to be a sign and a foretaste of what God wants to do for the entire cosmos. What's more, such people are not just to be a sign and a foretaste of that ultimate salvation. They are to be part of the means by which God makes this happen in both the present and the future. For people who believe in the resurrection and God making a whole new world in which everything will be set right at last, are unstoppably motivated to work for that new world in the present.
Unstoppably motivated. In the midst of the global environmental climate justice movement, thank God it is not just Christians and churches who are leading the way and agitating. But what would it look like for the church to be bringing in resources that are unstoppably motivated at this moment when so many are beginning to despair? We have got to tap into the resources of our faith and contribute them along with our whole lives and our denominational structures and our partnerships toward this great, great, great work of our time. So let me stop at that. I apologize again for having to move through so quickly through a lot of pretty thick material. But we've got just a few minutes left. Let me invite either just general response or sharing around where you see either malformed God concepts that are working against our efforts to care for, to do justice for the creation, and or where you're seeing signs of new theological understandings, or better, more faithful theological understandings, leading toward genuine fruitfulness. Yeah.
You're talking about malformed ideas. What did you tell the older man who came up to you and said he didn't believe in climate change because of God's providence?
Yeah. I rooted it in Jesus, and affirmed that what we say about God, God's power, God's relationship to the earth and to human beings, we root in who we understand Jesus to be. And that the power we see in Jesus is, again, as we heard from many here, is one of vulnerability, of presence. What we see on the cross is a God who does not sit aloof from the sufferings of this world, but whose own life takes on the sufferings, the brutality, the sin. And so to speak of God, God's power, God's reign, has to be spoken through who we understand Jesus to be. And so what's happening to the biosphere is happening in many respects to God's own life. God's self is vulnerable to what is happening. Sorry.
That's okay. Pat sent me some time ago, I asked for a bunch of scriptures. It's a scriptural study of the biblical basis for creation care. And so I do workshops. And what I have heard more than once, what keeps coming up is, well, God created mankind because he wanted children to love. And children need a home, and they need shelter, and they need clothes. And therefore he created everything on earth for us so that we can have what we need. And that was, and so the wonderful thing about the study that he sent me is that I can say, oh, well, let's just see what, that's really interesting. What does the Bible say about that?
Yeah.
And flip ahead to where it says, Jesus created all things in earth, under the earth, et cetera, for himself, and so, that I keep hearing that same thing over and over again. Plus the one that you already said. My parents told me about the resources that God gave them here for us to use, the oil and such. I've heard that one too.
This is why deep biblical study, deep theological engagement is so important. Again, it's not all the work. But many who are sometimes drawn to the work of justice seeking, of care of neighbor, service, don't always root it. And so we allow other narratives, other interpretations to be told. And so people think that's the only way to read scriptures, when the scriptures and our traditions have such a resource, a wealth of resources to support this work. It's great.
Yeah, I often, when confronted with somebody who says, this is the way God planned it or whatever, is that, and talking about where is that in Scripture? Where is global warming in Scripture? I said, time and time again from the beginning, there are these times where where God sets a covenant, and it's always between people and the earth and God, and that the consequences or the sin results in earth travail, and vice versa, and they're always interconnected, and so they would, and there's the if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, I will forgive their sins and heal their land.
Yeah, and if we don't, Walter Brueggemann's work on the Book of the Land draws this out, but there are images throughout the Hebrew Scriptures of the land vomiting out the people. The land itself has agency in the Scriptures. And faithfulness, disobedience, failure to love the neighbor and to do justice for the vulnerable leads to the land itself rejecting.
Native American and indigenous cultures, a lot of their creation stories, almost every one of them, are tied to emerging from the earth, from a mound or a cave, or falling from the sky when it got too crowded. And so the connection to the earth is just phenomenally close for Native people in comparison to people saying, oh, I'm distant from it. They're very tied to it.
And to, as you rightly noted, to very particular geographies, which is something that many of we European Americans, if we trace back far enough to our indigenous roots in Europe, had similar cosmologies related to particular geographies. But the devastating result of colonialism and a Christian theology that supported, sanctioned it, and justified colonial violence of the eradication of people so deeply tied to land was bound up in this understanding of the land, the people of the land, who are deeply connected with the rhythms and the spirit of land, are somehow not of God, or somehow demonic, when in fact what we desperately need right now are ways of reconnecting, not just to the earth in general, but to particular geographies. And so I'm continually encouraging our peoples to turn to indigenous practices worldwide to help us understand what that looks like. Do you have your hand up?
I do. I wanted to build on your N.T. Wright quote,
Yeah,
because
please.
in my church in Stockton, Missouri, we had studied 4 green Bible studies, and then we finally studied N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope,
Yeah.
which is the book you close with.
Yeah.
And that book, though it's really thick and really hard to understand, it helped us to form an understanding within our church of what I think your message was today. And we were trying to put it in the context of what does a creation care oriented church look like. And the language we chose was reimagine our discipleship journey. Why disciples conserve and recycle. And this was our second dead electronics recycling drive. And the language we pulled from mostly from N.T. Wright was, we wanted our whole congregation to get this. God made us in his image to steward his good creation, the creation he called good. Jesus' resurrection was the beginning of God's new creation. As disciples of the resurrected Jesus, we are God's agents of renewal. We deliberately conserve and resources and recycle as acts of discipleship. And I think that's what you've just said. We worked really hard to condense that down in a message that everybody in my congregation would grasp and hopefully adopt.
Fantastic. So I just got a timeout from organizer Paul Slentz. We need to make sure this space is available for the next workshop. So maybe one final, and then we'll close.
Here's my question. I've done concert tours and places with a lot of evangelicals.
Yep.
And abortion is their top issue. And yet, in talking with them about climate change, if they're going to vote climate change, 95% of the time, they have to vote for a Democrat who's pro-choice. And they won't cross that line. What can I say to them? What can we say to them that says, you know,
well,
what would you say?
Killing our earth is abortion. We're killing our future life by destroying our earth. So,
well, the affirmation of a life ethic is exactly right, and threading a life ethic through the entire span of a human life and all of the systems that are needed to support. And if what the concern is harm to human life and to the vulnerable ones, then engagement with climate change must move pretty close to the top. The further conversation around the realities of access to reproductive rights and the data that's clear that more progressive women-led policies around reproductive rights leads toward a lower abortion rate needs to also be part of the conversation. We also need to recognize that the movements that are bound up with the fossil fuel industry and other corporate interests that have utilized issues like abortion to drive a wedge through communities that might otherwise be engaged on these issues has been very, very successful. And so we need to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves to recognize how those tactics are working and try and find ways to counter them. That's another session, another conversation. But yeah, thanks. Thank you all. Appreciate it. I'm happy to engage in conversation.